Welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Meet the Scientists monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. June Gruber will present Positive Emotion and Reward Disturbance in Mood Disorders. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of over 190 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the Foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that BBRF-funded research has such a great impact is we do not limit ourselves to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded $475 million to fund more than 6,800 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. June Gruber. Dr. Gruber is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Colorado Boulder. She is a 2013 and 2019 Young Investigator grantee. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Gruber's presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the question tab on the control panel on your screen. Feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as possible in the time allotted. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Gruber. June, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and it's fabulous to be here today to share some of our work with you, looking at positive emotion and reward disturbances in mood disorders. One quick question, little technical slide issue. There we go. What I'm particularly excited about today is presenting work to you that really uses a broad and interdisciplinary clinical and affective science approach. So here we're trying to look at the ways that our everyday experiences of emotion and responses to exciting or reward-related stimuli may be especially important in understanding, diagnosing, and ultimately translating these findings to help build better treatments for mood disorders. What I want to start with today, though, is when we think about positive emotion and reward-related processes, this comes on the heels of a long-standing assumption for many years that positive emotions, feelings like joy, excitement, contentment, were predominantly adaptive, at least relative to negative emotions. And some early research in psychology pointed for good reason to all the positive benefits that positive emotions confer for us. There's robust findings linking positive emotions to greater creative or divergent thinking, building physical immunity to stressors, motivating our pursuit and attainment of important goals. And importantly, they're often thought to be the social glue of our lives. Positive feelings are what connect us with others and really maintain those vital social bonds. At the same time, a new kind of emerging wave, literally, hoping for some fun metaphors today, of research really began to point out a parallel and complementary line of research that also suggested that positive emotions may be related to a range of problematic mental health outcomes, especially when experienced to an extreme magnitude in a context that may be misaligned or for durations that may be prolonged. This includes, for example, problematic substance use, risky sexual behavior, spending sprees or pathological gambling, and even some longitudinal studies linking high rates of elevated positive emotionality, actually with greater mortality rates that have been linked to greater risk-taking and neglect of threats in the environment around you. So it's for this reason that I think what we want to focus on is the idea that positive emotions, although they can be beneficial to us, we also need to consider them in their totality, that when they're not appropriately managed or harnessed, they can also confer problematic mental health outcomes, but that we can leverage this understanding to better understand existing models of mood disorders and translate those towards greater evidence-based treatments. And this is the broad field that kind of echoes back to the title of my talk, where we think about the role of positive emotion and reward, both in mood disorders and psychological health more generally. This has been a key focus of my team's research, where we've presented work I'll share with you today and created some volumes to kind of bring this literature together. First, in 2014, putting together volumes that kind of looked at both sides of positive emotion and reward related processes, the way in which they're adaptive or beneficial, but at times maybe when too intense or not regulated well can also portend challenges to our mental health. And then later in 2019, editing a handbook that really tried to look at positive emotion and reward related disturbances transdiagnostically. So the way in which these challenges are both evident in mood disorders, but also in the context of substance use disorders, schizophrenia, developmental disorders, and the like. What I think is exciting about this work and why I'm especially looking forward to sharing this with you today is that it's a really growing field. We're really seeing that the number of citations of work that have keywords, whether it's psychological disorder or psychopathology or psychiatric disorder and positive emotion and reward, has really been kind of exponentially growing over the years. And for those of you who are students in the audience, there's a lot of work to be done. So my students and I have put together this chart where we try to lay out all the kind of dizzying and exciting dimensions of looking at reward across different levels of analysis, from our temperament that we're sort of born with to momentary responses we have at the state level to everyday stimuli, and then looking at that over time, kind of before we encounter a stimulus, our anticipation, during the moment, our online feelings, and later on, kind of looking at how these processes sustain over time. So there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of exciting work that already has been really hitting the forefront. And it's for this reason that my colleagues and I really felt that right now, we really feel that there's a change on the horizon and there's a real call to action. This was a paper that my graduate student Cindy Villanueva first authored with our colleagues Wendy Heller, Deanna Barch, and Rebecca Silton co-authored, really pushing forward and intentionally prioritizing this focus on positive emotion and reward in psychopathology. I'll show you some work today too that highlights what we think are key priorities to move this work forward. Both uncovering neurobiological mechanisms, but also working very hard to try to capture these experiences in the real world settings that people live in, often embedded in interactions with others, so very dynamic social contexts, increasing the diversity of perspectives, both of whom we study, which has largely relied on US-based populations and kind of homogeneous groups of people. How can we make that more diverse? And looking at this across the lifespan. Really looking at how we see change over time, from young adolescents at risk for mood difficulties to later on through adulthood, looking at how those have affected and changed over time. So it's with this motivating framework that I'll bring you to our roadmap today, kind of 5 minutes into our time together, that I will return to throughout the talk, where I first will walk you through some foundational kind of scientific puzzles that our lab grappled with early on in trying to bring in the world of affective science and reward to the study of mood disorders. So sort of a story of how we got started. Second, I'll turn to some of our key research priorities, where we're really trying to push the boundaries of, how we delve more deeply into mechanisms that help explain why these difficulties emerge, how we look at it across a broader, more diverse context of people affected by mood disorders. And then I'll turn to our kind of path forward, which I always find to be both humbling and eye-opening, sort of areas on the horizon that we're working on right now and really feel motivated as a field. So I'll start first with these empirical puzzles, and this is sort of a a bit of a story of how this work got started, and I hope gives you a sense of where we kind of entered this work first. Really, when I thought about the study of understanding reward and positive emotion, for many reasons, bipolar disorder was a prime entry point, and really became the basis and core of my lab's research, and I think really speaks to why we really center on and understand and care about bipolar disorder and related depressive disorders as well. For those of you who may be a little less familiar with bipolar disorder in the audience, it's a chronic, severe, and often recurrent psychiatric disorder associated with persistently and abnormally elevated periods of mood, what we call mania, or in its sort of softer form, hypomania. And for many individuals, though not formally required for a diagnosis of the most severe form of bipolar disorder type 1, many individuals also experience periods of depression characterized by prolonged sad mood, loss of pleasure, and associated symptoms. Importantly, bipolar disorder is associated with significant impairment. It accounts for up to half of inpatient mental health care costs. Nearly 1 in 5 individuals who receive treatment for bipolar disorder, or BD, nonetheless experience homelessness in a given year, and has been ranked as one of the top 10 leading causes of worldwide disability. So there's many reasons from a public health perspective that we need to better understand processes that may confer risk and may better help us develop evidence-based treatments, and truly motivate us to think of ways that we might want to delve a little bit deeper into understanding what is bipolar disorder and what drives it. When I thought about this from a diagnostic perspective early on in my career, I peeked into the DSM, or whether you use the ICD, and one of the things that really stood out to me was this prominent feature of elevated mood, abnormally and persistently elevated mood. Sometimes can also manifest as irritability. So I peeked into the core diagnostic criteria, saying that this was really the kind of entry or gateway into understanding and meeting criteria for bipolar disorder, but wondered what more there was out there empirically. I also, as many of you who may be familiar with Kay Jamison and her very eloquent writings, looked at some kind of anecdotal or first-person lived experience perspectives, where she described her own lived experiences with mania that centrally featured these kind of expansive and euphoric feelings. She said, "When you're high, it's tremendous. The ideas and feelings are fast and frequent like shooting stars, and you follow them until you find better and brighter ones. Shyness goes, the right words and gestures are suddenly there, the power to captivate others a felt certainty." When I say this to my students, they often say, well, what is the concern? Like, what's the issue? And there's always the and also the fast ideas become far too fast. There are far too many. Overwhelming confusion replaces clarity. Memory goes, humor and absorption on friends' faces are replaced by fear and concern. In a recent freely available interview series I created, it's called #TalkMentalIllness, for anyone who may be interested in seeing 10 to 12-minute interviews with leading mental health experts. I had the good fortune of interviewing Kay Jamison, and she said, when thinking about the world of bipolar disorders, that it would be hard, she said, for me to imagine a more interesting field. It is a field that is deeply rich in human experience, imagination, and science, and I truly couldn't agree more. So the puzzles I'll walk you through today are those where we try to bring in the lens of what we call affective science, bringing in the study of emotion and reward to better inform our understanding and really bring to light the sort of phenomena and the mechanisms of bipolar disorder. My lab takes a broad approach to studying bipolar disorders, looking at symptoms of mania on a continuum. On the far left are the kind of classic categorical diagnoses, where we're looking at individuals who do or do not meet criteria for a primary bipolar diagnosis. And if we move on that continuum from left to right, we see in the middle a group of individuals that we're working with quite heavily right now, which are those adolescents and emerging adults or young adults that are at elevated risk for mania or bipolar disorder, but have not yet met formal criteria. We do this through a series of different screening tools, from self-report valid scales like the hypomanic personality scale to looking at first-degree relatives with a clinical diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and other rates where we're trying to really kind of oversample individuals who may be at elevated risk. We also assess continuous symptoms of mania and depression as well. So we really believe in a broad-based approach to thinking about the advantages of both our categorical and dimensional models of mood difficulties. We merge this with bringing people into our lab and looking at emotions across multi-methods. This is what I think is so exciting about affective science, is you can look at emotion across levels of analysis. From on the left, self-reported emotion, simply asking people what they feel and having them report the variety and intensity of emotions they feel on a Likert scale. So we also look at people's nonverbal behavior. So I'm trained in the facial action coding system, where we can look at and literally code these micro-expressive contractions of muscles and the face that map onto these prototypical emotion displays, so we can better understand not only are what people feeling, but what are they displaying outwardly. And then we look at the body, broadly speaking, using peripheral, or what we call autonomic physiology, what's happening in the body, heart rate, skin conductance, respiration, skin temperature, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, really trying to get at the autonomic nervous system, both parasympathetic and sympathetic branches. And then we also look at kind of the central nervous system, and I'll tell you a little bit about some current studies we have using functional neuroimaging to better understand brain mechanisms involved in the generation of emotion and the top-down regulation, as well as reward-related networks. So there's a lot of tools that you can have at your disposal to better understand these processes. And finally, before we get to the data, to know that no one context you study people in is going to give you the end-all answer. So we believe in looking at these emotions across a variety of different experimental contexts, from showing people emotion eliciting films to static images or emotional faces, having people recall autobiographical or personal emotional memories from their own lives, to getting more social, whether they're interacting with another close person in their life, what we call a dyadic interaction, to empathic accuracy, where they're trying to understand the emotions of others, to how we convey emotions through nonverbal other forms of communication. So all this to say, this has helped us begin to start to answer literal puzzles, as my roadmap said, when it comes to bipolar disorder, to truly ask, is bipolar disorder associated with a greater size or increased magnitude of responding to reward-related or emotional stimuli? Is it pervasive across context? Are we seeing this elevated positive emotionality only to positive or rewarding stimuli, or is it more broad-based and sort of misaligning with otherwise neutral or negative situations? Which emotions are involved? So there's a wide umbrella. When we say positive emotion, there's a wide variety of different feelings, from pride and joy to compassion and gratitude. Those that are more self-focused versus socially focused. And then people don't just passively feel these feelings, they engage in active strategies to try to regulate them. So our individuals with bipolar disorder having problems regulating these intense experiences. These initial puzzles, and as I mentioned, will form the basis of new work we're going to show you of what we call the positive emotion persistence model, or PEP model, in bipolar disorder. This more simple kind of visual graphic for today will just kind of illustrate some of its basic premises. So if we have our bipolar individuals in yellow compared to a non-psychiatric control group in blue, what we found across studies is that individuals with bipolar disorder responding to a positive emotional situation will have a stronger reaction to it. This is what we also think of as reward-related reactivity. They have a greater response, both physiologically, and they self-report greater positive emotion when you show them rewarding or positive stimuli. But one of the things that then I found even more compelling is that it wasn't just a story of heightened reward sensitivity, but when we looked at these individuals across negative contexts, whether it was a negative film depicting themes of sadness and loss, or we looked at disgust eliciting films, which were quite visceral, and neutral stimuli. This pattern persisted across contexts where we are seeing individuals with bipolar disorder continue to exhibit this heightened positive emotionality, even in contexts that didn't really warrant or call for that kind of positive emotional flavor. And when we peeked more deeply into which emotions were driving it, it wasn't all positive feelings, but it was things like joy, excitement, pride. So these very high arousal or more self-oriented emotions. There were no differences in things like contentment or compassion or gratitude. That really wasn't what seemed to be driving these intense, high arousal positive states. And when we looked at how people then tried to downregulate these emotions, they reported difficulty in everyday life, even though they could do it when cued. So this led us to think about what might be driving these models, like what gets these intense positive emotions going, and then what maintains them over time. So we started looking at what we call driving factors on the left and maintaining factors on the right. When we looked at driving factors, we tried to understand what might get an intense positive emotional response going, kind of initiating it in the first place. Here we tried to first look at what do people literally take in? What's their visual diet in the environment? Are they taking in different kinds of emotional stimuli? So we did some early work looking at attention-related biases to positive stimuli, getting the sense in which, like, might they be visually attending to positive emotional features of their world that kind of gets those experiences going. We also collaborated with my colleagues Hetty Kober, Will Cunningham, and others, and David Glahn, looking at kind of reward-related networks. Indeed, finding increased reward-related networks, especially in the context of looking at responses to reward, finding elevated striatal reactivity. So it seemed like there were both these kind of cognitive level processes, kind of visually taking in more positive emotional information, and certain neural mechanisms that may lead people to kind of generate these greater positive emotional experiences. But then once they get going, what keeps them going? I thought a little bit of kind of, you know, the Newton's law of motion, but like thinking of this in the context of emotional experiences, like what sort of keeps these maintained over time. And this is what I think often has some of the most interesting clinical potential. You bring people into your office and sort of wonder, they report having trouble with these heightened positive states, but yet why do they persist? Here we looked at what we call these metacognitive processes, meaning what are people's emotional goals? In the kind of affective science world, we call these like emotional goals. So what do people want to feel? Often we're asking, what do they feel? What symptoms have they had recently? We spend less time kind of reflectively taking a step back and asking them, what are the emotions you value? What are the emotions that you want to pursue? And here we've done some work finding indeed that individuals with bipolar disorder or at risk for bipolar disorder but not yet diagnosed report elevated valuation of positive emotional states. They say pursuing these positive emotions is important to them. If they don't feel them, there must be something wrong. And so these kind of values really kind of help amplify and generate some of these emotions. We also find that they engage in strategies that even though they report greater effort in trying to regulate, they report less success. And part of that, when we look at the repertoire of different strategies they're reporting using, is that they report strategies that actually may be counterproductive. Things like rumination that involve kind of mulling over the emotional content of a situation in a way that doesn't help them move forward in solving it, but actually intensifies the emotional states. We also see they engage in greater strategies like suppression, where you try to mask or hide your feelings that may work in the short run, but they're not great in the long run. And that they tend to report engaging in a greater amount of all different kinds of strategies. So rather than picking a single strategy and really sticking with it, they're kind of trying everything under the sun, to their credit, to try to manage these perhaps overwhelming emotional states, but in a way that's ultimately not helping them kind of calm those emotional states down, but may actually be intensifying them and sustaining them over time. So I say all this because these initial puzzles, I think, really taught my team and I about some of the processes that may be driving bipolar disorder. That PEP model, heightened positive emotions, persist across contexts, and maybe ineffectively regulated. But I think they also teach us some bigger picture takeaways about these positive emotion valence systems. One being that positive emotion intensity may be best in moderation rather than maximizing positive emotion systems more generally. Second, that context sensitivity of positive emotion is central. So again, we find that individuals with bipolar disorder don't just report greater positive emotionality or show greater engagement in these brain networks associated with reward when you show them a monetary reward or a positive image, but they seem to be kind of stuck in an emotional high gear that they can't shift out of, even as the context changes, even as a threatening stimuli comes to the screen, or close relative shares a time of loss and sadness, they sometimes seem to be stuck in this heightened positive emotionality. So again, we know positive emotions are important. They have health benefits, but it's got to be in the right time, in the right place. We also, I always like to say that it's important to think of positive emotion reward not as a broad umbrella, but really as a category that has a lot of unique kinds of emotions underneath it, and that we need to get more specific and more nuanced, that these positive emotional states differ in whether they're high and low arousal. Think of joy and excitement versus serenity and contentment. Some are more self-focused like pride versus more outwardly oriented like gratitude. And they all have different functions. And so we need to pay really careful attention to which emotions are enacted in mood difficulties. And then we need to look at not just what people feel, but the strategies they use to regulate their emotions. And we find that in bipolar disorder, there's what we call this gap between having an intact ability to regulate when given a specific cue in a specific laboratory context, but then translating that to everyday life is where we see some of the challenges unfold. So looking at how we can better take the intact regulation capacities these individuals already have, these amazing regulation strengths, and how to help them bring that or translate that into their everyday life. So these kind of raise what I call these broader kind of foundations of different conceptual or empirical themes in positive emotion and reward-related disturbance. And as you can see, I was trying to do some alliteration today. So we talked about size, situation, specificity, and strategies. And what I'm going to turn to are some additional puzzles and priorities that are going to highlight some of these other themes that we've been working on. So I'll turn to our second stop here in the roadmap today, where I'll highlight some of our key priorities and findings right now. And again, this is echoing back to a recent paper we had, a call to action paper, really arguing for advancing the study of positive emotion and reward in psychopathology. I'll start with, and again, pardon my alliteration, with this idea of SPICE, and you might be wondering what precisely does that mean. Here I'm talking about the broad diversity of emotions people experience. I know I've been talking a lot about reward and emotion, but we know that those feeling states don't exist in a vacuum. They exist and co-occur with a broad variety of emotions people have in their everyday life. And indeed, we think about emotional diversity. What I mean by this is we looked to the natural sciences and the concept of biodiversity. And there's these well-known studies on biodiversity. And our thought was, how do we translate this kind of conceptual framework to the study of emotional diversity? So borrowing from what's a well-known index of biodiversity called the Shannon Biodiversity Index, we created a computation of emotional diversity. Here, this emotional diversity index captured things like the richness or the number of specific emotions people report in their everyday life, and the evenness or the extent to which these emotions are experienced in the same proportion. We have freely available syntax online if researchers want to apply this formula to their own self-report data where they've sampled a variety of positive and negative emotions, both in experimental studies, but also in everyday life. Some of our initial work looked at this in large cross-sectional samples of adults, finding that these measures of emotional diversity, which is greater overall positive and negative emotions, controlling for baseline intensity of both positive and negative emotion, actually predicted using a multiple regression model in these two large cross-sectional samples. We found that it predicted decreased depression symptoms, as well as decreased kind of what you could construe as more negative physical health outcomes, including fewer visits to the family doctor in the past year, fewer hospital-related costs, and fewer days spent in the hospital. We looked at this formula applied just to the distinct types of positive emotional terms, wondering if we could look at just positive emotional diversity alone, and generally replicated these findings, but in addition found that greater positive emotional diversity was also associated with a lower scores on a common kind of mania history measure, the MDQM. These findings were linear, they weren't quadratic, or what we call an upside down U. So it really did suggest that the more diversity in positive and negative emotions may confer some adaptive benefit. And in fact, our mood disorder symptoms were associated with a more restricted range of emotional experiences. Other researchers have taken these earlier findings of ours and replicated them to find emotional diversity predicts fewer symptoms of anxiety and depression in middle-aged adults, fewer markers of physical inflammation, and many more robust outcomes. But I always say, welcome those who disagree. Having just adopted a geriatric cat, I can really resonate with this image. There's a cat. He says, "I'm angry." The dog says it's okay to be angry. It's good to feel a range of emotions. The cat says no range, just anger. I want to just build on this idea of emotional diversity to say I've talked about the diversity of feelings people have, but there's also a lot of different ways people try to regulate their emotions. And so we've recently extended this work looking at emotion regulation diversity with several of our colleagues here, including 2 students I wanted to highlight, Katie and Bryn, where we looked at this across 2 studies, both in emerging adults and study 2, a clinically diagnosed sample. So by emotion regulation diversity, the same kind of model applies, but instead of just looking at feelings, we're looking at all the different strategies, a wide repertoire that people can use to regulate their emotions. And indeed, there's a fallacy of uniform efficacy saying that not all strategies are inherently helpful or unhelpful, but it's really about how we use them. So we are curious if we extended this similar kind of quantitative formula to different strategies, could we look at the variety, frequency, and evenness of people's emotion regulation, or ER, strategy use, with the idea that maybe having a more flexible menu of strategies will let people choose the right way to manage their feelings, whether it's distracting in some moments, or sharing with a friend in another moment, or reappraising or thinking about it differently after the fact. Is it better to have a more diverse menu of strategies? So in study 1, we looked at emotion regulation diversity and these mood disorder dimensions in emerging adults. These are young adults between the age of 18 to 25, and that are often recent literature suggesting at heightened risk for mood onset, as well as greater mood difficulties. So in this study, we had about 150, just shy, 149 emerging adults who completed what we call an experience sampling study on their smartphones for 14 consecutive days. At the beginning of the study, we got some kind of standardized baseline mood dimensions, measures of bipolar disorder risk, and symptoms, current symptoms of mania, and current symptoms of depression. And then for the next 14 days, they downloaded a free app on their phone, and we sampled them multiple times a day, asking what strategies they were using to manage their emotions in a given moment. These strategies included a variety of strategies, those that were categorized as more engagement or approach focused, where they are really engaging with the emotion. This included focusing, awareness, reappraisal, expression, and even things like self-criticism or acceptance, and those that were conceptualized as disengaging or kind of trying to avoid the feelings, distracting, suppressing, avoiding, relaxing. And then of course we got how they were feeling while they were engaging in these strategies, so we could control for the emotion in our analyses. Really interesting. These are brand new findings that are under review right now. We found that emotion regulation diversity was associated with greater risk for bipolar disorder. Overall diversity, really driven by these disengagement or avoidance strategies, but was not associated with any current mood symptoms. So it really seemed to reflect a more kind of trait-like tendency or vulnerability for bipolar disorder, less so being linked to their current levels of mania or depression at that time. However, this was not a clinically diagnosed sample. It was a sample of emerging adults, albeit they have elevated rates of mood health, but we really wanted to extend this to a more clinically stringent sample. So we replicated a similar design in a clinically diagnosed and recruited mood disordered community sample. This included adults with bipolar disorder type 1, the most severe form of bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder or MDD, and our non-psychiatric control group. They underwent a similar paradigm, 7 consecutive days instead of 14. They came to the lab. We oriented them to the study. Here they used a Palm Pilot that was set up with the experience sampling program software. And again, multiple times a day, they reported the same emotion regulation strategies, categorized as engagement or disengagement, and we also got their emotion experience. Really interestingly, in our analyses, again, we're seeing this really interesting tie with bipolar disorder, that greater emotion regulation diversity overall, though driven by these higher disengagement-oriented strategies, that those individuals are more likely to belong to our bipolar group than our control group. And that our bipolar group, however, did not differ compared to our MDD or control groups. So again, this really seemed to be tied with increased bipolar disorder group status compared to our control group, but not tied to MDD, our major depressive disorder, or our control group. So takeaway message here is from a broad kind of like, widening our aperture back, is that more might not always be better. When it comes to regulating feelings, that even though a greater diversity of emotions may be beneficial, a greater diversity of strategies you're using may actually be counterproductive, especially if they're strategies that are disengaging you from your emotions or helping you avoid them. And that specificity matters. We can't think of emotion regulation strategies as all the same. And there may be unique kinds of subtypes, especially these disengagement or avoidance oriented strategies that are maybe more tightly linked with mood disorder dimensions. And finally, it raised the question to us that maybe this is more a trait versus state marker, and that maybe emotion regulation diversity is tied more to trait-like risk or a clinical history of bipolar disorder than current depression or mania mood symptom severity. The last finding I want to walk you through is this finding on striving. And this is something I think is really important in a culture that often heavily emphasizes and values happiness or positive states. Indeed, we see happiness as something we deeply care about and assess at the global level. We're constantly seeing these updated world happiness reports. And I often think the context that I work in currently, which is in Boulder, Colorado in the United States, although not unique, there are places like this that seem to really elevate the idea of being a happy place, right? This picture on the right was from a museum I went to where it said, if happiness is a state of mind, then Boulder is its capital. My point being that we are seeing these elevated priorities towards being happy. Social media amplifies it among the youth. And yet might these values actually be counterproductive, or what we talk about as the paradoxical pursuit of positive states? I'll show you some data that was part of a large multi-site study. I definitely want to thank BBRF for supporting some of this work, where we looked at the idea of these happiness or positive emotion values and mood disorder dimensions in a sample of 789 emerging adults. These adults were recruited from a multi-site study. You can see the demographics here, the US, the UK, and also India. And here what we are really trying to understand is how might these values and pressures around feeling positive actually be counterproductive to mood health. We used a scale called the Happiness Valuation Scale developed by Iris Mouse and colleagues. Sample items include feeling happy is extremely important to me, and if I don't feel happy, there's something wrong with me. Higher scores on the scale were associated with greater risk for bipolar disorder, greater severity of depression symptoms, and quite paradoxically, lower subjective happiness and lower satisfaction with life. In earlier studies, we've also compared groups of individuals with and without a clinical diagnosis of bipolar disorder and depression. And using the same scale, we find, perhaps not surprisingly, our bipolar disorder group and our major depressive disorder group score higher on the scale compared to a non-psychiatric control group. So again, there may be something about this heightened valuation and positivity that may not actually be associated with both greater subjective happiness, but may actually put individuals at greater risk for mood health diagnoses and severity. I often turn back to things like this, quotes from John Stuart Mill, who said, "Those only are happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness." Some caveats to this work I just want to mention that I shared today is that certainly positive emotion and reward cannot be studied in isolation. They're one piece of a bigger kind of affective science and system puzzle. I hope some of that work on emotional diversity began to acknowledge that we've got to look at reward and positive emotion and the broader kind of affective system. As always, more work is needed. We need replications, we need with larger sample sizes, we need multi-site studies, we need more translational work. And I think science is always an enterprise of humility, where we find we're often still scratching the surface. There's various types. I outlined some themes of positive emotion disturbance today. I think we have many more to map and uncover. We are looking at this transdiagnostically. I highlighted mood disorder symptoms today, but we've been working on this, extending it to anxiety disorders, psychosis, and autism spectrum disorders as well, looking at this across the clinical syndrome and various contexts to be studied. I often have loved this metaphor when I show it to my students. It's from Hope Jaron, who says, remember, every time you see a tree, you're only seeing half of it, meaning we have much more that we have not yet discovered, and much awaits us with scientific discoveries and efforts ahead. I'll conclude with a path forward before we have some time for questions. Just highlighting a few current priorities. One of them I mentioned early on is how we've been extending this work to really broaden the context of whom we study, to ensure both are our findings generalizable, one, across all humans, or two, might there be an important role of cultural context that may shape some of these findings for individuals with different kinds of demographic backgrounds and cultural values that they're embedded within. Towards this end, we've done work with Jeannie Tsai at Stanford, looking at the role of affect valuation in mood disorder severity. One of my graduate students just defended her dissertation looking at positive emotion experiences and values among Mexican American emerging adults. And we have additional work we've been doing in Brazil with Paulo Boggio and his team as well, looking at the generalizability and robustness of our findings with these positive emotion dimensions in emerging adults, and also with the quilombolas communities as well. I also think it's critical, and I've highlighted a bit of this, but just to say much of our work is also centering on these clinical neuroscience and translational opportunities. We have many studies that if I had time, I would show you them all today. So I'll give you a little taste, where we've been looking with Jamil Zaki, Tor Wager, and others at brain predictors using neurocomputational signatures of emotion cue integration to better understand how we infer and understand others, what's called empathic accuracy, among individuals with bipolar disorder as well as major depression. So those analyses are underway. I could not have a talk without acknowledging my longtime collaborators, Sherry Johnson, as well as Josh Go and Katrina McRae, and others. We have a study that we're in the middle of right now, year 3 of a 5-year grant, looking at baseline assessments of positive and negative emotional regulation among young adults, either with early onset bipolar disorder at clinical high risk or clinical low risk, and looking at how some of these psychophysiological and neuroimaging tools might actually better help us predict first onset of mood difficulties as well as recurrence. So we're doing 2-year longitudinal monitoring assessments, really trying to translate the lab to the real world of their everyday functioning and mood difficulties. And finally, is something that's a little unique, is bringing in some of these positive psychology approaches. There's a robust literature in positive psychology looking at the role of these positive emotion focused kind of quasi interventions, where you can bring these naturalistic and scalable complements to existing evidence-based treatments, not as a replacement, but as a complement. There's been an interesting line of work looking at what are called awe walks, that are kind of a mindfulness-based oriented script that people will follow out in everyday settings. We've done this out in the mountains of Chautauqua and Boulder, and as you can see on the right with my lab team, out on the slopes in the Colorado mountains, really looking at the extent to which some of these experimentally driven scripts may produce some complementary and beneficial outcomes for mood health. We looked at depression, anxiety, stress, and bipolar related dimensions as well. My student Stevie is defending her dissertation in 2 days on this very topic. So I think we need to bring in kind of outside the box approaches as well. Finally, I'm just going to touch on something that's been near and dear to my heart and that took a long time for my colleagues and I to write together because it's a difficult line to straddle when I say we want to acknowledge studying the complementary, quote, positives of mood disorders, and I'll explain what I mean by this. Today, I've really focused on, talking about the potentially, quote, maladaptive aspects of positive emotional processes using bipolar disorder as a lens. What I want to suggest today is something that does not paint a Pollyanna portrait of any mood disorders, but acknowledges some of the strengths that may also co-occur. So in this way, we're thinking of might there be silver linings or potentially adaptive aspects of emotional difficulties. And let me explain what I mean by this. So we know that in many ways, psychological disorders, including mood disorders we've discussed today, but this can range across substance use, anxiety, and related disorders, have typically been conceptualized in what's called a deficit approach. This is how I was trained, where we really have thought about from a treatment perspective and acknowledge the real world realities that many psychological disorders are often chronic, painful, and disabling. Indeed, I presented evidence to you at the beginning looking at the significant functional impairment of bipolar disorder, and this has led to groundbreaking research on the etiology and mechanisms underlying symptoms. At the same time, embedded in this model, and I think I'm guilty of this as well, has been an unintentional framing of many of our findings in the context of what I call the 4Ds. We often use terms like disturbance, deficit, disruption, dysfunction. I've probably said these words many times today, and unintentionally and inherent in the kind of schemas what we think about conceptualizing and studying mood disorders is they may portray an overly singular view that may be negatively biased and may even unintentionally perpetuate embedded and entrenched stigma against severe psychiatric disorders. And perhaps, could it be neglecting a piece that is also true alongside the often chronic and devastating consequences of mood disorders? Might it unintentionally overlook a piece that may be true for some individuals at some points in their mood disorder trajectory? And this is an approach my colleague John Rottenberg and I, along with our students, have called the silver linings approach, which its tenets are that psychological disorders can also have positive characteristics. These can precede, co-occur, or follow from experience, and they can occur across multiple domains. The huge caveat in all of this, of course, is our goal is not to portray a simplistic or Pollyanna portrait of psychological disorders. That's far from it. We've worked, treated, and both talk about family members of ours who have lived through some of the most devastating of mental health difficulties. But it's simply to highlight that there may be a piece we're overlooking. This idea of silver linings resonates already with strengths-based approach to mental health disorders and lived experience of patients and clients who successfully navigate their experiences. It builds upon a dual continuum model, which emphasizes that mental health and illness are not opposite ends of a single continuum. They're not polar opposites, but that they may exist in duality and in parallel. And for many of us who are certainly fans of Stephen Hinshaw's work on stigma, acknowledging these features while not portraying a Pollyanna view may at least offer some antidote to longstanding stigma that is embedded in severe psychiatric disorders. This is something we've been looking at through our own work in the literature, looking at evidence of heightened creativity or gifted neurodivergence. I'll show you some data from our lab today that looks at the social positive sides of mood disorders, from empathy and cooperation and connection to a long-standing literature on resilience and post-traumatic growth. But let me just give you an example of what I mean and what kind of initially turned me to even thinking about this. And it came to me through data, not through personal conviction. I'll show you some data in mood disorders where we've looked at cooperating, connecting with others, and having greater empathy. So in terms of cooperation, I'll show you some data with my colleague Desmond Nong at UT Austin and Jamil Zaki at Stanford, where we employed a well-validated behavioral economic cooperation game. And this was a task that's been utilized in the basic science literature for many, many years. And we employed this task among individuals with a clinical diagnosis of bipolar disorder, depression, or healthy controls. And without going into too much detail, we brought our participants in for an interview, and they participated in this well-established what's called a trust game, where you're effectively looking at how much individuals are more likely to trust and cooperate in terms of monetary money that they have with a hypothetical investor. The upshot of this, though, and I'm happy to explain the game more to anyone who's interested, is that we found using the standardized tasks that actually our mood disordered groups, both depressed individuals and bipolar individuals, actually displayed greater cooperative behavior than our non-psychiatric control group. This was measured in terms of repaying more to the investor. So using a completely objective behavioral measure of cooperation, our mood disorder groups were more other-oriented and they cooperated more. We've also looked at how people connect with others, looking at a multi-site study on social networks in emerging adults. Again, thank you to BBRF for helping support some of this work. Here we were really interested in the ways young adults describe their social connections. This was a large study of emerging adults from the US, the UK, and Canada. And here we used well-validated tools of social network analyses. These have been used by Talia Wheatley's group at Dartmouth, where they asked college students in this context to just name as many first-year peers as they would like that they identify as friends. So here we get what is the size of their social network, how many friends do they report having? And then to measure more of social network quality. So of those friends, how many could you go to share good news with? Or how many could you turn to when something bad happens? When we looked at this kind of collapsing together, we actually found a really interesting pattern that our young adults and our bipolar risk dimension was associated with greater quantity or larger social networks, and some aspects that suggested maybe some greater aspects of quality. And finally, I want to turn to empathy, because I think in a time right now in our world, we think of empathy and connecting and supporting others as more important than ever, especially in our young adults. This was a study where we looked at empathic accuracy among 120 emerging adults and looked at how a well-validated measure of hypomania or bipolar risk predicted how well people really understood or got the emotions of others. This was a task developed by Jamil Zaki at Stanford, where our participants came into the lab and they watched a video of what's called a target. And by target, this was a real person who was sharing a real life event. And this was our kind of negative context where this woman was sharing a negative life event of a time where her mother was passing away. And this is a real human being sharing a real story. So they watched this video, and at the end, they report how did they feel when they heard this person sharing this, very sad life event. And then emotion perception, what did they think that woman felt when she was sharing that event? What we found is our measure of bipolar risk, the HPS or hypomanic personality scale, actually predicted people feeling more positive, not negative, when hearing this negative story. And they also had a more positive empathic accuracy bias. So at first, when I saw these findings, I said, okay, so individuals at risk for bipolar disorder, they may be missing the mark of the social world. Someone's sharing a really negative life event with them, and they're feeling more positive, and they're kind of putting a rosy colored lens onto interpreting that person as feeling more positive. And this for a long time was the story of disrupted empathic accuracy in bipolar disorder. But I'll tell you this, and this is the story of the silver linings, that certainly is true, but it's not the whole story. When we went back to the data and looked at these second by second ratings of individuals while watching the videos, another piece of the story came out. So if you looked at our target, that's the actual woman sharing the story, and you see her in blue at the top, second by second how she was feeling while telling that story. Those little gray bars indicate when she had a bit of an emotional upshift, or when she reported feeling a little bit better at different moments in the story. Now, what's really interesting, if you look at one of our sample participants, the red line below, you'll see that, yes, their overall positivity is way higher than the target. But one thing that's really fascinating we found is that they were better able to detect these moments of emotional upshifts. They picked up on them right away and with greater ease, those gray bars. They picked up right away when that target started feeling a little better. So although they may sort of be globally much more positive than this context calls for, there's a strength embedded here too, where they're really good at picking up those positive emotional moments in others. So it's a complex story, and my hope is that we simply don't not unacknowledge the silver linings, that they're there alongside the challenges. And I say this all because some of these silver linings are embedded in individuals' experiences and contacts with others. And as the Dalai Lama said, we humans are social beings. We come into the world as the result of others' actions. We survive here in dependence on others. And for this reason, it is hardly surprising that most of our happiness arises in the context of our relationships with others. So I'll end with just a quote. Because I think this was a piece that I wrote as former editor at Perspectives on Psych Science with my editorial team, that at the day our hope in psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience is ultimately to find ways to use our scientific insights to contribute to a healthier, happier, and more sustainable world. And as William James said, act as if what you do makes a difference, because it does. So thank you for listening today. I hope to bring up some questions, ideas, and curiosities, and open it up to any questions people may have. I can stop showing my screen.
Good. June, thank you so much for really an excellent presentation covering a broad range of issues. And I have to say, I like how you present the silver lining approach without minimizing the negatives of certain illnesses, but also saying, hey, maybe we could focus on any positives that a person has to help them and to take advantage of that positive. I think that's a really good approach. And I'll ask you, from a clinical standpoint, what types of things can a person do, or can a clinician do, to help emphasize those positives?
Yeah, I love that point. I absolutely resonate with your perspective. Our hope here is that we can not just acknowledge strengths individuals bring into the room, but leverage those strengths, right, for a better kind of treatment outcome. And my thought is, some of these findings suggest that maybe we ought to really, when we're thinking about different interventions, whether it's behavioral activation or scheduling these positive activities, that maybe we ought to bring in some of the strengths people have in their social lives, whether it's the desire to connect or a desire to be more kind and pro-social to others. Some of the other strengths I didn't talk about today, and more kind of the cognitive realm, are, this whole literature on creativity and mood disorders, and making sure that you're acknowledging that that may be an important piece of someone's identity, and how to build a treatment plan that may both help them attenuate problematic mood symptoms while also acknowledging and finding ways to maintain creativity if that's part of their professional or personal identity. But I think first acknowledging what people's strengths are, and then finding ways to enhance them, and certainly ensure that treatment doesn't impede them. And that's a challenge, I know, sometimes.
Yeah, no, excellent point. I want to ask you about, when you're speaking about emotional regulation strategies, again, clinically, are there approaches that people can take on their own, or a clinician could help them take in terms of that emotional regulation?
Absolutely. I think first step is psychoeducation. I think we can all do a better job of educating individuals of what are the different kinds of strategies that exist, both what they are and practicing them, and then giving more, I think, cue dependent guidance on how to use them. There's a very interesting literature that when we're in a high intensity state, that is not the time to engage in cognitive reappraisal. It is overtaxing our executive functioning in that moment. But in those moments, there's other strategies that we can use, whether it's intentional redeployment or distraction, to kind of bring the intensity down, to then benefit and reap more kind of positive outcomes from reappraisal. I think there's moments we can talk about when do mindfulness-based approaches work well, and what are the kind of contexts and situations, and when for some individuals it might not be the right point in treatment for that to be the first kind of strategy to try. So I think giving people both a knowledge of the different strategies, and the different contexts in which some can be more or less useful, because that's the point. No one strategy is going to save the day across every context, but you need to think about, are you alone? Are you with others? Are you having a very overwhelming high intensity state versus more moderate? And how close are you to the time an event has occurred? Are you anticipating it's about to happen, a stressful situation? Are you in the throes of it, or is it later you're trying to kind of recapitulate and reappraise and problem solve where to go next? I think that's one place we could do a good job of, and then give people a greater menu of helpful strategies and when to use them.
Well, June, I want to again thank you, and we're going to want to have you back in the not too distant future to hear about some of the ongoing work that you're doing in this very important area. So thank you so very, very much.
Thank you for having me.
I also want to thank everybody who joined us today and ask people to consider making a donation to BBRF. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that if you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientist. To make a gift, please visit us at the website bbrfoundation.org or call at 1-800-829-8289. The webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it with a friend, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. And join us again next month when we present another research webinar on Tuesday, June 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We look forward to seeing you then. And again, thank you. Remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Take care.